last week, we were mainly talking about plant competition, and how each plant needs to have enough light and water and nutrients, and the planting distances that the books tell us may seem huge when we're planting things out, but they're there to make sure that plants aren't competing with each other, and that gives you the ultimate yield. But it's only able to give you the ultimate yield if you've got enough nutrients in your soil. Otherwise they won't fill the space, and then you land up with weeds growing in between. We talked about thinning carrots and parsnips and the importance of doing that at the right stage, so that they're not competing, because they just won't get any bigger if you don't thin them. And we talked about deterring the carrot root fly by putting some strong smells around when we do that. We talked about thinning beetroot and radish, and how the urgency to thin them is not quite the same as with the carrots and parsnips, but you can basically let them get quite big, and then when you harvest them, you're thinning. And there's always, in a clump of beetroot, there'll be one bigger than the others, and same with radish. And of course, radish are very, very quick crop. So you start harvesting them when they're sort of 6 weeks from sown, and by 8 weeks, they're starting to go over and go woody. We talked about catch cropping, and that's underplanting and getting crops in and out very quickly. And what we might think about with brassicas as we go through today is what crops can you put in the big spaces between your main crop brassicas. And then successional sowing we mentioned last week, and that's really something we should start to think about now, because as you harvest things, you're going to have gaps, and so you need a little bit of thought beforehand so you're ready for those gaps, with plants ready to transplant into them. So, you know, garlic is coming ready now, so if you put in a crop of garlic, you'll be harvesting that. You might be harvesting your early potatoes, and then suddenly you find yourself with clear beds, or you've harvested your cauliflower, and then you've got a great big space that you could be putting something else in. So it's worth now sowing some more seeds in readiness for those gaps to come up, so you can put something in to follow on. So this week we're going to really concentrate on the brassicas and the ongoing care of them, and then pests and disease that affect brassicas, but also that affects all the crops in your garden as well. So the brassica family is an amazing family because we can eat every part of the plant, and so it means that there's a lot of brassicas that we eat, and that can be problematic if we're thinking about rotation, because there are so many brassicas, and sometimes we forget that they're brassicas. So we've got the leafy brassicas like cabbage and spring greens, Brussels sprouts, the oriental vegetables, which are very popular, Chinese leaves, rocket, mizuna, mabuna, tatsoi, all of those are brassicas. And often the sort of Chinese leaves and the rocket, people plant with their salad, which is lettuce. That's a different plant family. But it's fine to plant it with the lettuce, as long as you remember it is in the brassica family. It's going to have the same pests and disease. It's going to need the same soil condition. And if we're trying to rotate, we need to be conscious of that. We then got brassicas that flower, like Calabrese, which is the summer flowering broccoli, the ones with the big heads that you buy in the supermarket. We've got broccoli, which is more spears and side shoots, like purple sprouted broccoli or 9-star. And then we've got our big hearting cauliflowers. And we mentioned those briefly last week, and again just now, that you've got to harvest it before those tight little flower buds start to open. And then we've got our stems and roots, which often these get grouped in with the root vegetables. And people maybe don't even know that they're brassicas. So radish, swede, turnip, kohlrabi, they're all brassicas, prone to the same pest and disease. And they like the same soil condition as brassicas, but they will also benefit from a more free draining soil like your other root vegetables would do. So when we sow brassicas, we can either sow directly, and if it's the root crops we're thinking about, like the swedes and turnips, they benefit from being sown directly into the soil rather than in pots first. Brassica salad, we can either sow directly in seed drills, thinly, or we can plant them in pots and modules and then transplant them later, same as you would do your lettuce. But the slower growing brassicas are best transplanted, and the reason for that is because they take so long to develop into their ultimate size. So cabbages, kale, you're planting 45 centimetres apart, 1.5 foot apart, but Brussels sprouts, purple sprout and broccoli, you're looking at 75 centimetres. It's 2.5 foot. That's huge spacing. So you don't want them to take up that space in your land until they need that space. Therefore, we start them early, grow them on, and then plant them out later in the season. So we can either sow the seeds in seed trays. The only downside of seed trays is that you're scattering the seed in a tray, and it's very easy to oversow. So you land up with crowded seed trays with too many seedlings in it, and then you get damping off because there's no air circulation. And a packet of cabbage seed can have 500 seeds in it. And you're never going to grow 500 cabbages. You just wouldn't have the space for it. So you only need to be sowing, 5 cabbages is enough for most people's veg garden. And if you do sow in a seed tray, you've then got to prick them out and plant them on into another pot before they go in the ground. The other way is that you have modules, and a module is a seed tray with different compartments in it, and those modules can be various different sizes. And you put one seed in each module, and then it grows, and you are able to take that whole module out with no root disturbance at all, and just put that module into a bigger pot. So it's very quick and easy. It takes longer to sow the seeds originally, but it's much quicker when you come to pot them on or plant them out. The disadvantage of both of those is that you have to buy in compost, or you have to go out and make your own compost or scrape up some molehills or something. The other option is you make a seed bed, and traditionally brassicas were always grown in a seed bed. It's only been last 30, 40 years that everyone's used potting compost, because I suppose people have more money now than they used to. So a seed bed is an area of your garden which is well prepared. You've removed all the perennial weeds, and you've created this nice nutrient-rich soil that looks like potting compost. Basically, it's friable, it's crumbly and light. And what you do in springtime is you leave it empty and you hoe it, and then you wait a week or two, and then you hoe it again, and you do that a few times, and then you get a clean seed bed with no more weeds coming up. And then it's really easy and safe to sow your seeds in that seed bed in rows or however, and no other weeds are going to come up. There's no competition. A benefit of growing brassicas like that is that then there's no that they can get their roots deep into the soil, find their own nutrients and find their own water. And I find you get much bigger plants by planting them in a seed bed than you do in trays and modules. I forgot I had this slide, so I'll come back to it. So seeds, one thing I'll say about seed trays and modules that I missed is you can use ordinary potting compost. You don't need any special potting compost. Even though brassicas like alkaline soil, most potting compost that you buy, unless it says ericaceous, is a neutral pH, so it's suitable for all things. But obviously, if they're in seeds trays or modules, you need to water them regularly. They really don't like any check to the growth, so they don't like being droughted at all or staying in the pots too long. So the timing is quite crucial with those then, because they're totally reliant for you on water and nutrients because they're in little pots. But then when they get to the 6 to 8 leaf stage, that's true leaves, not seed leaves, then they're ready to plant out. And that's usually around 6 to 8 weeks. And of course, if your ground is not prepared, then your bed's not ready, or the weather's not right, or you're busy at work, or you're ill or something, then they land up getting checked to the growth because they're in the pots too long. Whereas if you've got them in a seed bed, they're in the open ground, and the timing's less crucial because they can access water and nutrients themselves and they can expand a bit. So you've got a little bit more leeway on planting them out. So what do brassicas like? They like an alkaline soil. The next slide, I've got a picture of the pHs of soil, and we talked about it briefly last week. So we've got alkaline, neutral, about 7, and then acid is the other extreme. And brassicas like alkaline soil. And what a lot of us have in this area is a clay acid soil. So it's not best suited for brassicas. But one thing you can do is you can do a pH test to test that. The other thing they like is a consolidated soil. And this doesn't mean compacted, it just means that it's settled and it's stable. And this is particularly important for the hearting brassicas, because if the soil is too light and fluffy because you've just dug it over in the spring and it's all light and fluffy, then your hearts go light and fluffy. So your cauliflower heart will open sooner than it should be. So it might start a little small like this, and instead of getting bigger, it opens up because your soil is very open. And the broccoli will do the same, and cabbages will do the same, rather than forming the nice tight heart you want. So the way to get a consolidated soil is to do the soil preparation in the autumn and then let it settle over winter. Now, the problem we have here in Wales is we have such heavy rainfall over winter that if you leave your soil bare over winter, you get a very compact surface. So it's worth sort of mulching it or something so it's covered over the winter. The main thing brassicas dislike is a check to their growth, particularly the hearting brassicas. So if they're root bound, they're suffering drought, or they're lacking nutrients, which are all things that plants suffer if you have them in little seed trays or modules and you don't get your timing right, then they won't form the heart. You'll just get an open leafy plant. So this is a pH chart. It's quite a complicated one, but what it demonstrates, across the top you can see the pHs. So extremely acidic is 4. Now, hopefully none of you got soil that is 4. That's very acidic. That would be, something you'd find in the kitchen. But your soil, for a strong acidic soil, you'd be looking at something like a 5, and that would be if you're living at the top of the Haffron forests in the conifer woods. but you know, it's a sliding scale, and then when we get to 7, that's neutral. And if your pH is 7, you can grow any plants. They've got full access to all the nutrients, and if they're alkaline lovers or acid lovers, they'll still do well in a neutral soil. And then when we go the other side, we're going along the alkalinity. Now, what makes a soil alkaline is how much calcium is in the soil. So if you're on the White Cliffs of Dover, where there's lots of calcium rock, then you'd have an alkaline soil. So we can adjust the pH of our soil by adding lime. That's adding calcium. Other things that have lime are wood ash from your fire. So you can save your wood ash all winter when you're having fire, keep it dry. And then you can sprinkle it on the beds. It's very fast acting soil improver. It's water soluble, so you don't use it in large quantities, and you keep it dry until you want to use it on your bed. So one thing that's worth doing is getting a pH test. Can you all see me? This is a little pH test. You can buy it in most garden centres. Only £2, and you get 2 tests in this. You open up the packet and you get a test tube inside, and then inside the test tube, oh no, this one's got 1 test in it, is a little tablet thing with powder in it. You break that open and put the powder in the test tube. Some of them come with the powder just in the test tube. And you put a little bit of soil in there, you put some water in there, deionized water from a kettle or something, give it a shake, and then the solution in here changes colour. And can you see that? You've got different colours here that give you an indicator of whether or not you've got acid or alkaline soil. Very simple, basic test. It's not going to give you the exact number, but it gives you an indicator. I think these tests do go off because sometimes I've had them and they're not working. So to get a new one, I would. The other one you can buy are these testing kits. These cost about £7 and they do 15 tests. So if you've got a bigger site or you want to do it with some friends, it's quite a good one to do with your friends as a activity. Maybe Mach wants to do it, get everyone together to do it, because when you've just got your own test, it's quite hard to see what colour you can see whether it's orange or whether it's green, but the in how extreme it is, it's hard to see when you've just got 1 test. But if you've got a classroom of people and you've got 10 tests, you can see the degrees of acidity or the degrees of alkalinity on how strong the colours are. But worth doing anyway. It's only cheap and it gives you an indicator. And if you've got an alkaline soil, great, you're going to grow really good brassicas. If you've got an acid soil, acid soil is good for beans and peas and all your soft fruit. And most of us in Wales are pretty good at growing soft fruit, but each site can be different. So even if your neighbours say they've got acid soil, you know, if you've got lime render on your house and that's been breaking down all the flower beds, veg beds near the house, you might find it alkaline. So it's worth having a look. Anyway, you can see in this diagram that when your soil starts going acidic or alkaline on the extremes, certain nutrients get locked up. So it's not that they're not there anymore, it's just that the plants can't access them. And that can show in nutrient deficiencies. So on an acid soil, phosphorus, which is needed for root growth, can often be deficient. And you can see how narrow that white line is. That's another thing we talked about last week, was the main nutrients the plant needs. They need nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, all in large quantities. Nitrogen is for leafy growth, phosphorus for root development, and potassium for fruit and flowers. So it's the potassium that plants are needing at the moment to make sure that you get your courgettes and your squashes and your tomatoes keep developing. Sulfur and calcium are needed in big quantities, but as long as you've got good organic soil, you don't usually find you're deficient in that. So brassica planting distances, we talked briefly about this last week, but the recommendations on seed packets and books seem completely bizarre when you read them for the first time, and it says 70 centimetres apart. That's a huge distance when you're gardening in a small garden. But these distances have been well researched for many, many years, and they are the optimum planting distances to get the highest yields you can get from that crop. But that is dependent on you having the nutrients in the soil to grow that crop that big. And often when they say 45 centimetres down the row and leave 75 centimetres between adjacent rows, that's to allow you space to get between the rows to harvest the crop. But many of us now, instead of doing open field planting, we do bed systems. And the idea of a bed system is that you don't walk between the rows of vegetables, you have paths and you have beds. And that way you can push things closer together, and instead of leaving big spaces between each row, you can plant in a block. So all the spacings are the same distance, either direction. For example, so all your cabbages would be 45 centimetres apart each direction. So if you are planting in a bed system, the ideal bed width would be 1 metre 20, and that allows you to be able to reach the middle of the bed without stretching or without being tempting to tread on the bed. And often when people are making their new veg gardens, they'll push that a little bit wider and go, oh, well, 1 metre 20, 4 foot, I'm sure I can reach 5 foot, and then I've got less path space. But what happens is you land up not being able to harvest stuff properly in the middle, not being able to reach easily into the middle of the bed, and you'll end up treading in it. So if you land up closer planting because you haven't got enough space or whatever, what you'll land up with is smaller crops. So like we were saying last week with the carrots and parsnips and things, if you don't thin them, you're just going to get small, thin carrots and parsnips. So it needs to be done. With the brassicas, you'll get smaller heads. So for cabbages, for example, you might not want a great big cabbage head that big. It might take you longer than a week to eat that. So planting them closer together, you might go for 30 centimetres, for example, and then you just get smaller heads, which are more manageable. And a lot of people are doing that now. But you have to remember the cabbage that you actually eat might be that size, but on the outside of that, it has huge, big leaves, and they do need to have space, because otherwise you get no air circulation and you'll get mildews and rots and a lot more slugs. So there's lots of things we can do with our big brassicas for making use of that big space. So although we're going to transplant them, we still need to transplant them when they're quite small plants. So we're looking at 6 to 8 leaves. So these plants here probably got 10 leaves there or so. So they'd have been transplanted for a little while, and they're just starting to get going now. And they'll quickly go from that size to being quite big, bulky leaves. So if you're going to do a catch crop or you're going to undersow it, you need to get those crops in early or even before you plant out your brassicas, so that you can get them out of the way before the brassicas need that space. So the sort of things we can grow that are fast growing are lettuce. Now they're in a different plant family, but often we plant lettuce with our brassicas because so many of the brassicas we eat as salads, like rocket and pak choy and mizuna. their brassicas. So grouping the salads with the brassicas in our rotation helps with keeping on top of that. Radish, very quick growing, but if you plant radish in amongst all your big brassicas, you'll have a lot of radish to eat all at the same time. So when you sow radish, you need to sow small, short rows every week or two so that you get a continuous supply rather than it all coming at once. You can companion plant in between, and someone said about nasturtium earlier. Nasturtium does get a bit rampant and wild, and what I do is I plant it, it looks lovely. I use the flowers in my salad bags because you can eat them, and then if you haven't picked all the flowers, you quite quickly get these seed pods and you can eat them as well. So think of it as well as a companion plant as another crop that you can harvest from. And the seed pods you put in vinegar, and they're an alternative to capers. They've got a nice peppery crunch to them. And then once they start getting too rampant and too big and competing with my main crop plant for that bed, I just take them out. And there's usually another one coming, and the seeds will germinate quite quick if you leave them and come up. Or just cut it back so that it's not, you might not pull it out completely, but you just cut some of it back and it'll grow from what's left. Nasturtiums attract black fly, and it's often talked about as a good companion for broad bean, for the simple reason that the black fly are then attracted to nasturtiums rather than being attracted to the broad beans. In my experience, they just attract aphids to the crop generally. So I don't put them with my broad beans, I'll put them somewhere else. This picture at the bottom there has got tagetes, which is a type of marigold. It's the half-hardy marigold, and that wards off whitefly, which is another form of aphid. And whitefly particularly like cabbages and brassicas, so that's quite a good companion plant there. You've also got some onions, spring onions or something in that bed, and again that's another smelly crop that will ward off the cabbage white butterfly and other flying pests. You can plant a fertility building green manure crop under your big brassicas, which I've often done. You have to have a low growing green manure. A green manure is a plant that's grown to benefit the soil rather than a harvest crop. So if you're under sowing with that, it needs to be a very low growing plant and not too vigorous, something like a white clover or tares, and that keeps the soil covered, keeps it mulched, stops leaching, and then when your crop's finished, it's there over winter to protect the soil, and in the spring you can dig it in as a bulky organic matter to feed the soil. But with all these things, the timing's crucial. If you put your catch crop in too late, then your main crop's going to be wanting that space. So we move on to some brassica pests. We've got root bugs, and it's not something I've ever had a problem with, but you often see on allotments people putting collars around their brassicas. They might make them out of bits of carpet or cardboard, and you just cut a ring with a slit in it and put that around your cabbages, and that stops the fly laying its grubs in the soil around the brassicas. And you can use a heavy mulch as well, so you're rising the soil up so it can't get in there. I mentioned aphids. Woolly aphids and whitefly can be a problem with the brassicas, but if you have a diverse system with lots of different flowers that attract predators, then that shouldn't be a problem. If you've got a monoculture and you haven't got those other things in there, hibernation homes and things, then aphids can be a problem. But usually when I see aphids on any of my crops, I just keep an eye on it for a week or two, because I don't panic about it straight away, because it usually means there's going to be some ladybirds coming and some hoverflies not far away. But the main pest that brassicas have, and I'm sure you've all seen them, is the cabbage white butterfly. Well, it's the caterpillar. It's the caterpillar of the butterfly that is the problem. So we see the butterflies flying around, lovely. They're both white. There's 2 different types, and we all love seeing butterflies. But then they go and lay their eggs onto the brassicas. So you've got the large and the small cabbage white, and they grow into either green caterpillars or a sort of stripy caterpillar. I was going to put a picture on here, but I haven't, but I'm sure you've all seen them. The green ones are the worst ones because they're very hard to see, and they often hide along the ribs of the leaf. So it's very easy to miss them. And of course, they're on the underneath of the leaf. So you have to look underneath to check them out and catch them. There are 3 generations of caterpillars in a year, and the butterflies fly and mate and then lay eggs. Now, if it's really sunny and lovely weather, they fly and mate and lay eggs for longer. If it's very wet and rainy, they don't live as butterflies as long, so there's less eggs laid. But there's 3 generations. So the first one are the butterflies that come out of hibernation. And so there's only very few eggs. And if you spot them at that time, you can get rid of the caterpillars early on in the season and stop them multiplying. Whereas if you miss that first one, which you probably will, because it's very early and there's not many of them, then they breed and become the second generation. And the second generation is when the damage starts happening. So that's sort of now, really, and the caterpillars getting nice and fat on our brassicas. So it's really important at this point to go around and on a small scale, you can hand pick the caterpillars off. And like I say, you have to look on the underside of the leaf. And if you don't pick them off now, then they reach adulthood, they breed and lay the 3rd generation, which will decimate your crop in a day. And that's when you have a total wipeout and lose all your crops. On a small scale, I think the best solution is hand picking. Birds will pick some of them off, but birds can also be a problem in picking out flower buds and stuff as well. On a bigger scale, organically, they use Bacillus thuringiensis, which is which deals with it. You'd spray it onto the crop. It's allowed organically, and that would sort the caterpillars out. So then we come to diseases of brassicas, and the main one is club root, and this is why we always talk about rotating our crops. There's certain crops that have soil diseases that will stay in the soil for a long time, and club root is one of those. So club root will live in the soil for 15 years, and it does what it says. It makes the roots get big and club-like, and then the roots can't absorb water and nutrients, and the plant stops growing. And once you've got club root in the soil, it's in the soil and it'll be transported on your boots and your tools, and it quickly spreads all around your garden. So it's something you want to avoid getting in the first place. It lives in the soil for 15 years, and there are lots and lots of brassica weeds. So they work as a host plant to continue the disease in the soil. So we rotate the crop to avoid a build-up of brassicas in the soil. And this is why it's important to know what brassicas are in the family, so that we're not planting brassica salads in one bed and cabbage in another bed and swede in another bed. And it's very easy to suddenly have brassicas all over your garden. And it's more likely on acid soil. And because brassicas are quite a hungry crop, we usually muck our beds before planting brassicas, but muck is an acidic organic matter. So we are making the conditions that clubroot likes. So we have to be aware of that. And also when we buy in plants to plant, we have to be conscious about where they've grown and whether or not we'll be importing any clubroot with them. And I think this is why there's been a move towards buying brassicas in modules and pots, rather than in the past, they used to be sold bare root, which means they were planted in someone's garden, someone's field, and then they were dug up, wrapped in newspaper and sold as bare root plants. But of course that's taking some of your garden soil with them, and then you can put it into your own garden, which you don't want. So clubroot is a problem, and once you've got it, it's very hard to get rid of, because even if you rotate, those brassica weeds can keep it going in the soil. And so it's very hard to have a 15-year break from brassicas and start again. But there are certain things you can do. You can make the soil more alkaline by liming it. There was lots of research done on making rhubarb juice and putting rhubarb in the bottom of your planting hole. Grow your brassicas in coir pots until they're quite big, and then just put them in the soil to finish them off. So there are many things that can be done if you find yourself on land with clubroot. Obviously, if you've got an allotment and they say the allotment's got clubroot, then be very careful about your boots and your tools when you go back home to your own garden, because you can take it on any soil. And so that's the main reason why we rotate our crops, is because brassica clubroot is one of the worst soil diseases. Another big soil disease, which is why we rotate, is onion white rot. Onion white rots the top of your onion, so it doesn't store. So they grow fine, they look great, and then when you go to harvest them at the end of the summer, the tops are a little bit soft, and then you go to dry them, ready to keep, and the tops just rot away. And if it gets really bad, then you're not able to grow onions at all on the land. And that's another soil-borne disease that is very common on allotments, because people grow the same crops again and again on there, and it's very easily spread from one allotment pot to another. So they're the two worst soil-borne diseases that we can get. Like I say, is why we rotate. But beans and peas that we talked about last week, they're not prone to any soil diseases, so we don't really need to rotate them. And traditionally, people would put up their runner bean poles in the allotment, and they'd always plant their runner beans in the same place, because it's quite a job putting up the supports for your runner beans. But the reason we include them in the rotation is because beans are nitrogen fixing and they're deep rooting, and they benefit the soil for the next crop to come. So it's beneficial to rotate them. I've just noticed someone said in the chat, what are brassica weeds? There are a lot of brassica plants generally. So brassica weeds would be things like hairy bittercress. That's the main one. There's the one with the pink flowers, which name escapes me, lady smock. And of course your brassica flowers like wallflowers and things like that are all in the same family. The other thing I've put there down for diseases is fungus rots and molds and general yucky, stinky stuff. These are all caused by, like like we've said in previous weeks, fungus is caused by high humidity, bad airflow, wet conditions. So if your soil is poor, saturated, wet soil, you can get root rots and things like that. If you plant them too close together and there's no air circulation, then you'll get fungus rots on the leaves. And what you can do is you can remove the lower leaves to increase the airflow. Same as we were talking about with the tomato plants the other week. You know, as we're going through the summer, we're not in the southeast where it's nice and hot. We're in wet old Wales and it gets very humid. So it's quite good at this time of year to take away some of those lower leaves. And it clears the soil a little bit and prevents the slugs climbing up the leaves and munching all your crops. And it increases the airflow, reduces the rot. So that's the end of my prepared presentation. What I was going to talk about now is I thought we could have a bit of an open discussion to finish off and just talk about what pests and disease people are experiencing in their garden, what troubles they're having, and see whether I can help at all with that.